June 1st, 1967. The Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the most anticipated album in rock history. 3 days later, on June 4th, Jimi Hendrix opened his London concert with a cover of the album's title track. Paul McCartney was in the audience. When he heard Jimi playing his song, a song that had been released just 72 hours earlier, Paul started crying. What happened backstage after the show became one of the most beautiful moments in rock history. To understand why this moment was so powerful, you need to understand what Sgt. Pepper's meant in June 1967. The Beatles had stopped touring in 1966. They'd decided to focus entirely on studio work, and for months, rumors had been swirling about what they were creating. The British music press was calling it the most important album ever made before anyone had even heard it. When Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was finally released on June 1, 1967, it exceeded even the impossible expectations. It wasn't just an album, it was a cultural event. The cover alone, with the Beatles dressed in colorful military uniforms, surrounded by cardboard cutouts of historical figures, was revolutionary. But the music inside was something else entirely. Songs like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, A Day in the Life, and the title track, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, pushed the boundaries of what people thought popular music could be. There were orchestras, sound effects, complex arrangements, and lyrics that demanded to be analyzed and discussed. Within hours of its release, every serious musician in London was studying the album. Record stores couldn't keep it in stock, radio stations played it on repeat, and in living rooms across Britain, people sat in silence, listening to this new sound, trying to understand what the Beatles had just done. One of those people listening very carefully was Jimi Hendrix. Jimi had been in London for about 8 months. His band, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, had become one of the hottest acts in England. Their first single, Hey Joe, had been a hit. Their debut album, Are You Experienced, was climbing the charts. And Jimi's live performances were legendary. The guitar tricks, the showmanship, the raw talent that left audiences stunned. But despite his growing fame, Jimi, at his core, was a music fan. And like every musician in London that June, he was obsessed with what the Beatles had done.
Jimi got his copy of Sgt. Pepper's on the day it was released. He took it back to his flat and listened to it over and over. The complexity fascinated him, the production choices inspired him, and the title track, that opening blast of sound, those horns, that rhythm, captured his imagination immediately. "I want to play this," Jimi told Chas Chandler, his manager, the next day. Chandler looked at him in disbelief. "Jimi, the album just came out yesterday. You want to cover a Beatles song that's 24 hours old?" "Yeah, man," Jimi said simply. "I want to play it at the Seville show." The Seville Theatre show was 3 days away. It was an important gig, a Sunday evening performance at a respected venue in London's West End. The kind of show where music industry people came to see and be seen. Chandler realized Jimi was serious. "All right," he said, "but you've got 3 days to learn it." "That's enough," Jimi replied. What Chandler didn't know yet was that he should probably invite the Beatles to come see it. Over the next 72 hours, Jimi Hendrix did something that demonstrated not just his technical ability, but his deep understanding of music. He didn't just learn to play Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, he absorbed it. He understood its structure, its feel, its intention. And then he figured out how to make it work with his 3-piece band, guitar, bass, and drums, without losing any of the power of the Beatles' elaborate studio production. Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding, Jimi's bandmates, were initially skeptical. The song was complex, full of horn parts and studio effects. How were they supposed to recreate that live? But as they rehearsed, they realized Jimi had found a way. He was using his guitar to suggest the horn parts, bending notes to create the sound of brass, using feedback and distortion in ways that captured the energy of the original without trying to copy it exactly. It was a tribute, not an imitation. It was Jimmy's way of saying, I hear what you did, and I respect it so much that I'm going to honor it in my own voice. Meanwhile, Chas Chandler was working on something else. He managed to get word to Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, that Jimi Hendrix was going to open his Seville theater show with a cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on June 4th, just 3 days after the album's release. Epstein was intrigued. He told Paul McCartney about it. Paul's reaction was immediate. I have to see this. On the evening of June 4th, 1967, Paul McCartney and Brian Epstein arrived at the Seville Theater. They didn't sit in a private box or backstage. They sat in the audience, wanting to experience the show the way everyone else would.
The theater was packed. The Jimi Hendrix experience had developed a devoted following, and people were there to see the guitar pyrotechnics, the wild stage presence, the unpredictable energy that made every Jimi show an event. As the lights went down and the crowd began to cheer, Paul McCartney had no idea what he was about to witness. He knew Jimi was going to play his song, but he didn't really understand what that meant. How could anyone already know this song well enough to perform it? The album had been out for 3 days. 3 days! Then Jimi walked on stage. He picked up his guitar, he looked at the crowd, and he began to play the opening chords of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The first thing Paul noticed was that Jimi had nailed it. Not just the notes, but the feel. The rhythm was perfect. The energy was there. Somehow, in just 72 hours, Jimi had captured the essence of a song that the Beatles had spent months perfecting in the studio. But it was more than technical accuracy. Jimi was putting his own stamp on it. His guitar sounded like a horn section. His voice carried the same playful energy that Paul had sung with. And the way he moved, the way he attacked the song, it was clear this wasn't just a cover. This was a statement of respect. Paul McCartney felt his throat tighten. Tears started forming in his eyes. He couldn't quite explain why he was having such a strong emotional reaction, but something about this moment, sitting in an audience, listening to someone else perform his song with such obvious love and understanding, moved him deeply. This was his music, his creation, something he and the Beatles had poured themselves into. And here was this American guitarist, this wild talent who'd only been in London for a few months, paying tribute to it in the most sincere way possible, by making it part of his own show, by declaring to everyone in that theater that this song, this album, was important enough to celebrate. When Jimi finished the song, the crowd erupted. But Paul barely heard the applause. He was wiping tears from his face, completely overwhelmed by what had just happened. Brian Epstein, sitting next to him, noticed Paul's emotional state. "Are you all right?" he asked. Paul nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he managed to say, I can't believe he did that." After the show, Paul insisted on going backstage. He needed to thank Jimi personally. He needed to tell him what that performance had meant. Backstage at the Seville Theater was chaos, as it always was after a Jimi Hendrix show. Band members, roadies, managers, friends, and hangers-on all crowded into the small space. Jimi was in the center of it all, still wired from the performance, his guitar still in his hands. Then someone said, "Jimi, Paul McCartney is here."
The room went quiet. Everyone turned to look as Paul McCartney walked through the backstage area toward Jimi Hendrix. Years later, people who were there that night would describe the look on Jimi's face as pure joy mixed with nervousness. Jimi was confident on stage, but off stage he was often shy, especially around musicians he admired, and Jimi absolutely admired the Beatles. Paul walked straight up to Jimi and pulled him into a hug. No words at first, just a genuine embrace between two musicians who recognized something profound in each other. When Paul finally stepped back, his eyes were still wet with tears. "That was incredible," Paul said. The album's been out for 3 days. How did you learn it so fast?" Jimi, in his characteristic soft-spoken way, almost seemed embarrassed by the question. "Man, I love what you guys did. I had to play it. I hope it was okay." "Okay?" Paul laughed, wiping his eyes again. "Jimi, that was one of the most beautiful things anyone's ever done. You learned our song in 3 days and played it better than I could have imagined. That's not okay. That's incredible." The conversation that followed lasted for hours. Paul and Jimi, along with Brian Epstein, Chaz Chandler, and a few others, ended up at a nearby pub talking about music, about songwriting, about the future of rock and roll. Paul was fascinated by how Jimi thought about music. Jimi talked about hearing songs in colors, about feeling rhythms in his body, about trying to capture sounds that existed in his head. And Paul, who just spent months in the studio with the Beatles trying to capture their own impossible sounds, understood exactly what Jimi meant. "You have to come to Abbey Road," Paul said at one point. "You have to see the studio. You'd love what we're doing there." "I'd love that, man," Jimi replied, and he meant it. The mutual respect between these two musicians would continue until Jimi's death in 1970. Paul would later say that Jimi was one of the few guitarists who truly understood what the Beatles were trying to do with their music. And Jimi would tell interviewers that meeting Paul that night, receiving that acknowledgement and respect from a Beatle, was one of the highlights of his life. But the story of that June 4th performance became legendary for reasons beyond just the personal connection between two great musicians. It became a story about what tribute really means in music. Anyone can cover a song, but what Jimi did was different. He didn't cover Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band because he thought he could do it better. He covered it because he wanted to honor it. He wanted to tell the Beatles and tell the world that what they'd created mattered, that it was important, that it deserved to be celebrated immediately, not later when it was safe and accepted, but right now while it was still new and revolutionary. The speed of it, 3 days, made the gesture even more powerful. Jimi couldn't wait. He couldn't spend weeks learning it perfectly. He heard something beautiful and he had to share it immediately, even if it meant working around the clock to get it ready. And that urgency, that passion, that sincerity, that's what made Paul McCartney cry. Because Paul recognized something that every artist hopes for but rarely receives, someone who truly understands what you're trying to say. In the years since, many artists have covered Beatles songs. Some of those covers are technically perfect, some are interesting reinterpretations, but very few carry the weight of that first Jimi Hendrix performance, 3 days after Sgt. Pepper's was released, in front of a Beatle who was moved to tears by the gesture. Paul McCartney has told this story many times over the decades. Each time there's a wistfulness in his voice, a recognition that something special happened that night that can never quite be recreated. Jimi could have played anything that night, Paul said in one interview. He could have played his hits, done his usual show, but instead he chose to open with our song, a song that was 3 days old. That's not showmanship, that's love. That's what musicians do when they really care about music. And that's the real lesson of this story. It's not just about technical ability, though Jimi's skill was undeniable. It's not just about speed, though learning a complex song in 72 hours is impressive. It's about recognizing greatness when you see it and celebrating it immediately, without hesitation, without jealousy, without calculation. Jimi Hendrix could have waited. He could have learned the song properly over weeks. He could have avoided the risk of messing it up. But he didn't wait, because when you hear something that moves you, when you witness something that changes music, you don't wait. You celebrate it now.
And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the person who created that beautiful thing is in the audience, hearing you honor their work and understanding exactly what you're trying to say. Paul McCartney's tears that night weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition. They were the tears of an artist who realized that his work had reached someone, really reached them, in exactly the way he'd hoped it would. And Jimi Hendrix's tribute wasn't just a cover of a song, it was a conversation between two masters, conducted through music, saying things that words couldn't quite capture, saying, "I hear you, I understand you, what you've done matters, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." 3 days, one song, two legends. One perfect moment of musical brotherhood that reminds us all why music matters in the first place. If this story of respect, humility, and genuine artistic appreciation moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the best way to honor great art is to celebrate it immediately and sincerely. Have you ever been moved by someone's tribute to your work or deeply touched by someone else's creation? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the moments of beauty and connection that make music history unforgettable.